Our next session today is with Christian Potts. He is the senior political correspondent for Vox. He covers the Democrats. His most recent story was about politics on TikTok, but
Yes,
before that, the second most recent one was on Biden's documents drama and the impact of that. So he will be here to talk about that today, also to talk about, kind of looking ahead to 2024. I know that 2024 coverage is something that weighs on a lot of you, and everyone's kind of going to get thrown into no matter what your beat. So anyway, with that, please join me in welcoming Christian.
Hi, everyone. Oh, mic's on. Wow. Okay, exciting. First, thank you so much for, letting me talk and just get to know you. I'm really excited to meet all of you. I did get a chance to try to look through all of your work before coming because I was like I want to learn from them just as much as I guess I'm supposed to talk about what I've done. But yeah, I'm Christian, politics reporter for Vox. I'm from California, which actually plays a really big role in how I think about my beat and how I think about a lot of just the news of the day. I guess I'm not entirely sure that I have a whole spiel or thing to deliver. More so, I really want to get questions from you, get to that eventually. But I guess the things when it comes to 24 and when it comes to the documents and when it comes to just the news of the day, I think I've crafted out a nice kind of area of coverage for myself because I don't feel like I'm necessarily bound to the day-to-day and breaking news. I think a lot of my specific work comes from my previous experience in writing and in journalism, which takes the form of more narrative and more reported argument is kind of the thing that I was kind of trained before getting to this specific role. And then Vox famously does explanatory stuff. So kind of getting into more of the how the average American would try to understand a news story or try to understand politics. So I think my position right now is one that's lucky because it kind of marries the two together. Vox 2 famously has gone through different iterations of itself. And the current iteration is kind of trying to, in my perspective, and the way that I view this job, is marry those two kinds of style of writing and reporting. So going in with an idea of what this news of the day has to say about the greater role of American politics in people's lives, how people care or why they should care about specific things, which is the documents. I was actually trying not to write about it and trying not to cover it because I felt like everybody was doing it. And that kind of gets me to another bigger question in my kind of writing and how I think about journalism, which is not doing the story that 20 other outlets are going to do or 20 other people are going to do, and trying to figure out a way to carve out new space and try to push the national conversation forward, whatever that is. So I definitely think that today, when I think about what that national conversation is, there are kind of two things that inform my journalism, which the first one is going back to kind of how I started in journalism, which is my parents were both immigrants from Mexico. They came to the US when they were undocumented. They thought that assimilation was the most important and the kind of the primary thing that they needed to get done early on before I was born. And then when just growing up, realizing that a lot of my exposure to news was in the context of trying to explain American politics or things in current events to them. And so that's kind of a really important function, I think, of my work now, is putting myself in the position of my parents, people that I grew up with back home, and thinking about how I could try to explain classified documents or something like that to them. And that kind of manifests itself in the conversations that I have with my family when I ask them, how do you consume your news? Where do you go for it? How much do you read? How much time do you tend to spend thinking about Joe Biden or thinking about breaking news of the day? And then trying to write a story that could do the best version of that for them. Which then gets me to the second thing that I think about with my politics coverage is that other part of trying to tell the story that 20 other people haven't done, which is usually, you might have heard this before, but when everyone's zigging, you should zag. When everyone's looking in one direction, you should look in the opposite direction. And I think that's true. that can bring you some of like the best news stories or enterprise ideas. But I think it's also not necessarily zagging, but like looking where everybody's running and trying to understand what it is that they're missing. And I think, for example, this document story that you mentioned, I think the big thing that was missing in a lot of the coverage that I was reading throughout last week was how little the average American cares or knows about this. And there is polling that's done on this, like polling that, I think all of the Sunday shows last week had like this percent of Americans think that Joe Biden's doing a good job. This percent think that he's doing a bad job at like explaining or kind of handling this classified investigation. And we obviously have a lot to learn from polling from previous elections. And obviously, I don't know, I'm on the side that thinks that most of the polling was actually pretty right this last election cycle, which I know there's a lot of discourse on that too. But knowing that polls can only tell you so much, and that if you ask somebody whether they care about something, it's more likely than not that they'll try to give you their best version of an informed answer, which might not necessarily show up in other polling that shows like, did this change the president's approval rating? Not really. Like, then does that story matter? Yes. Why does it matter? And then try to explain that in a pretty succinct way in that piece. And that's kind of how I ended the piece, was like trying to go into some of the specifics about why this does matter. And I actually had a very lively conversation with my editor about like how to use the word scandal and how to use the word like controversy, because it definitely felt at the beginning of a lot of this coverage that if you're in DC and you cover DC politics, this naturally matters to you and it's naturally important. But if you are back home in California, in my case, with my family, and you are actually worried about the price of eggs, like it's more of like an entertainment story than it is like a news story. So think about ways to try to marry or connect those two. The entertainment aspect of it, where like even at the Grammys last night, people were joking about classified documents and like, does that mean that your politics hard news story is going to matter to the average person? Maybe, maybe not, but find the way to try to make it matter, and try to find reasons to kind of connect it to that bigger picture. So yeah, I think that's definitely kind of the way that I think about my job now. And the way that I think about like 2024 and like elections and politics. It's like definitely last year, there was that really big question of, should Democrats be going harder in on economic issues? Should they be playing up social issues? As somebody who covers the Democratic Party, like that was something that I spent every single day thinking about like, okay, it's pretty bad that nobody has an idea of what Joe Biden's record is. Like, it's easy to both say that he's accomplished more than he has and to attack him for not doing enough. And for that, I think I relied a lot on calling on like the average person that I met when I was out in different states reporting and stuff like that, to try to get an idea of what it is that they wanted to hear more from, or whether they had heard from a candidate. And I think that's one of the really big questions for 2024, especially I cover Latino voters as part of my beat specifically. And for the last, I don't know how many, since 2020 at least, a little before that too, with the midterms in 2018, the question of like, have Democrats won this voting demographic completely? Are they losing it? Like, what is it? Is it more of like a case that they feel that the party doesn't represent them, or is it that the party is going too far to the left and it's like something about the word Latinx and something about like the way that they talk about very progressive policies that turns Latino voters off? And I think the fundamental question that was missed there was like, getting back to this bigger question that just kind of confuses me a lot about American politics, is like, do they know what's going on? Like, do people like my family know about the specific policies that a politician that's running for their specific area stands for? Do they know the difference between like Green New Deal and like what the Inflation Reduction Act does, and whether there is a Green New Deal at all, or there is some kind of like platform that everybody agrees on, which famously there's not. And so that's kind of how I approached the question. It was like, do you actually know what like Democrats stand for? And do you know what a Republican who's trying to get your vote stands for? No, it's partially then the solution is it's because you haven't heard from these candidates is one big thing. And then that gets us to a bunch of hosts of other questions about how much investment these parties are making in this specific voting demographic. And I think that's going to be hugely important in 2024. I think it's our job to try to hold even those people who claim that they stand, like have, are pushing forward the banner of representation or of inclusion or of outreach, and ask them like where the money is going, ask them what specific districts or neighborhoods they're in, ask questions about whether the policy that they're pushing forward on Capitol Hill actually, people back home know, because I feel like when you talk to a politician about their platform or about some kind of policy that they're pushing forward, they tend to be like, yeah, I talk to my constituents back home. And then I think one of the big things is like find those constituents, try to get them to, tell you whether they've actually heard from this politician before. And one of the best ways to do that is to travel when you can and to go to those places and just like post up outside of a restaurant or like in a mall. Like, I think that was one of the most interesting conversations I had this last year when I was in Nevada, was going to like a predominantly Latino Mexican American supermarket and just like talking to people about whether their senator was actually, showing up or not, and was actually part of this. I'm thinking right now of a story that I wrote about Catherine Cortez Masto and about whether or not she was leaning more into her Latina identity, given that she is technically the first Latina senator. And the other people at the time were reporting on this too. And so I wanted to actually like ask somebody who only speaks in Spanish whether they feel like their senator is kind of exploiting their identity, or kind of using identity and appeals to representation to make up for a lack of outreach or presence in that community. And it was interesting because people would say, no, but I haven't seen her, I haven't heard from her, but I know who she is. And like, I recognize that not all of us speak Spanish. And that was pretty enlightening. And I presented that question to her when we talked later for that story, about that, how comfortable she felt talking about her identity. And that kind of got me to this bigger question about Latino politics in the US and about who on the Hill really like understands what that is, especially given that there's all these conversations about like whether there is a such thing as like the Latino vote, or a such thing as like a Latino person in the US, or how you can have somebody claim to be Latino but also have, it was really interesting, I think, that specific case, because there was a bit of unwillingness on the part of the senator to fully kind of answer the question famously. And so I think the way that I got around that was to try to just ask her very specific things. We went to like a Mexican American mariachi band rehearsal at a high school nearby. And I was just like watching her and trying to get a feel for how comfortable she was in that environment. And then I'd ask like people on the street, like whether they'd ever seen her before. And surprisingly they had, so that made it into the story. Yeah.
So I do cover also the Latino vote as a Latina myself. And I don't know if you've encountered this, and if you have, do you have any advice on how to handle it? Obviously, sometimes when I'm covering, especially, it doesn't get a lot of coverage here, specifically here in DC. I do cover a lot of topics related to Puerto Rico. And sometimes when you get the opportunity to talk to senators who have the final say, or it's an important topic, and you get the opportunity to ask that person a question, and obviously you in this case, I might be covering it for my social media, because I do have people who follow me that follow me because my coverage for Puerto Rico. So I asked the question regarding Puerto Rico, and there's this sense of like, why did you waste a good opportunity of a question about Puerto Rico? So this kind of like this pressure of like a sense of there's not a lot of diversity still in DC. And when it comes to like policies that do affect Latinos, there's still like a lot of like pushback when you ask questions at the Hill. And I don't know if you've encountered this, like when you are asking like senators or congress members how do you deal with this? Obviously, because if you do have, and I ask you this because even back home, there are a lot of people who don't understand the difference between being a Democrat or being a Republican. So I do also have to ask the basic questions. And I have to go back to the basics. And I sometimes might seem as a person who's asking dumb questions. And it's basically, I'm not asking dumb questions. I'm just putting myself in the shoes of people who don't necessarily have the knowledge. And I'm trying to get all those answers for them because they just don't know the political system of the US, which is basically the system that have the final say on what happens to them. So I don't know if it has happened to you in that sense, and how do you cope with that?
Yeah, I don't know that I can say that I've had that same experience.
Not at saying,
but I think there are two really interesting things there. So first, you're absolutely right that it's difficult to try to explain some of these really insular and things that require you to go back to basics. But I think that it's important to do that and have that moment and not to feel ashamed that you have to even engage in that conversation. I think you're actually pointing to something that could become a story idea, which is like a kind of like a Capitol Hill culture kind of a piece, which is the kind of thing that I'm also trying to do more of, that I feel is interesting to people outside of DC because they don't understand how things work in the Capitol. And it's a potentially good way for you to try to get at the question, like, why is it that so few Republicans or Democrats even understand what American the federal government's policy and work with Puerto Rico is and looks like. And then kind of find some characters and people on the Hill who do understand it better and ask them how it is that they get it. Is it because of identity? Is it because of family? Is it because, they've just worked on that issue for a really long time? And ask them if they've ever worked with or tried to explain that kind of understanding to other colleagues of theirs. And so I can say that I haven't, I guess the equivalent to that would be trying to, I guess like one of the similarly granular and difficult things to explain is like the filibuster and why it exists. That's like the first thing that comes to mind. And when you talk to like the average person and try to explain what it is, it also similarly comes off as like, this is the final say as to whether or not like we can pass all these massive pieces of legislation last year, and kind of get a sense from people back home, from family, from friends, from people, like sources that you have on the ground, and try to get a sense of like how the best way to explain that would be in their lives. Would it be in the context of like healthcare costs and drug pricing and that kind of stuff? And then try to tell a human story about a moment where the fact that the filibuster exists means that a person doesn't have access to something. And that's a way to kind of humanize a topic that's kind of difficult to explain. So in the context of Puerto Rico, you can do that through like that kind of culture kind of sense piece, or you can do it through something still very human, like lingering effects from the hurricanes and the infrastructure problems that exist in the island, and how so much of that is limited and hamstringed by Capitol Hill not being able to take up policy on that.
Yeah, and in the term in Puerto Rico's case is there are things that are different, obviously, because obviously Puerto Ricans can't vote. So it's a little bit more complicated, but obviously the fact of I do sense, and this is something I'm relatively new to the DC area still. I wasn't I was expecting a little bit more. I did think that more people were covering these topics. And I was expecting more people covering Latinos and all that, and I got shocked, to be honest. And obviously it's a great opportunity to start covering it, but every time I do ask about these things, even it's even the pushback from Congress members, of like as you mentioned, like my constituents, I've been talking to my constituents, and it's like, have you talked to your constituents? Because they don't know anything about this. So it's kind of like that situation.
I would just try to keep as many notes as you can about who it is that you talk to and the kinds of response that you get from them, because you might not be able to write about that now or report on that right now, but it'll be really helpful to try to do like a step back kind of a piece that takes a look at some of the cultural problems with politics still in DC and why even among journalists it's difficult to ask about certain things or get substantive responses, because that's like a very easy example of like you're not necessarily zagging when everybody's zigging, but you're kind of taking a step back and observing how people behave and observing how journalists behave with members of Congress, how staffers talk about these issues, because sometimes you also find out when you're on the Hill too, that there's just like a very big underbelly of staffers and folks who think very differently from the folks that they staff. And by building those kinds of relationships and trying to get a sense of what it is that they wish their member talked about more, whether it's on background or off the record at the start, you also get a lot of material to work with for a bigger story in the future. So it might not be something that you write about now, but it's something that you're keeping track of so that you can work on that kind of a bigger project later.
Hi, I'm Joseph Choi with The Hill. I cover healthcare. As you said, DC can get really insular, and it kind of, and it can we cover these national policies that affect everybody, but we kind of get grouped up here in the diamond, and oftentimes I feel like we take polls and what PR firms are telling us as what the people think or what people across the country are saying. So how would you kind of connect with constituents or people just who are being affected by these policies? You mentioned you go up to people on the streets. However, budgets and geography and timelines
sure.
often limit us. So what are some methods from where we are that you would recommend for getting in touch with the audience that is affected by the policies that we cover?
Yeah. Famously, I'm told that there's an advertising recession, and that's a problem for journalism right now with budgets. I think I try to take as many of those PR calls, or tried to take as many of those PR calls as I could earlier on in my career, because you talk to the average person who's there, and you don't necessarily use that material, but you ask that person then to connect you with family members or people back home in their whether it's like a specific district or in a specific state, and they might have families spread out who would want to talk about something like that too. And so you kind of use that person to branch out to another person, or you try to find like community groups in those areas. And I'm thinking here like churches or like community health centers, or I think churches have actually been pretty helpful for me in trying to reach people, especially like Latino voters who might not be that kind of like progressive that you would get connected to through one of these PR groups or like big established advocacy groups. So I think that's like a very easy way to try to get in touch with folks. And also, it comes naturally through just talking to people, even here in DC. Like you ask somebody at happy hour about their life and about their background, and they tell you a bunch of stuff about like the kind of community that they come from. And then you ask them, it might not be for the story that you're working on now, but you're like, eventually I'd love to talk to folks from that specific community or neighborhood that you're from, because it's just really interesting to me. And you don't necessarily need to like use that material, but it's helpful to just get an in to somewhere that isn't DC, I'd say.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah,
Hi.
James here. Actually, I ended up also covering that same race, the Cortez Masto there.
Yeah.
So part of my sort of question was, and you kind of talked about bringing up the context a little bit before, but contextually at a time, and as we kind of like all know, American politics is fairly uncertain and very like wild in terms of knowing. And so when I was there, I was doing sort of the same things, just trying to go outside the campaigns, talking to people, going through each day. But I wasn't always feeling like, how do I convey a little bit of that kind of uncertainty? Or do you kind of have like the sort of the same feelings of, you're really contextualizing this of what you're doing maybe with the Biden documents right now and the relevance and how it might affect but there's so much that can be changed. I was wondering if there's a way that you feel like sort of uncertain, and you're not really feeling like authoritative, or do you feel that there's an easier way of trying to convey that maybe something at this moment does or
Yeah.
doesn't matter?
Like in terms of when you're talking to people or when you're writing about or
Yeah,
reporting on it?
yeah,
Or-
writing and reporting on it, because it's famously for the race, the master race was very close and could have
Yeah,
gone either way.
yeah.
And so you're trying to glean a little bit of insight, especially for internally and externally explain to your audience, how did we get here? And sort of there's also this degree of, we don't really know a
Yeah.
little bit. And I was wondering, just based on your experience covering a lot more of the Democrats and doing more campaigns, how do you sort of convey that almost to your audience, or do you feel like it needs to be done?
Yeah, I think history is really helpful. And so I think in that specific case, if you go back to a few cycles ago, like, I think it was a really important thing to like mention that there was a red wave in that state, like as early as 2014. And that there were like incredibly tight races that even Harry Reid like almost lost. And that kind of reference back is important to convey to the reader without necessarily directly telling them like, I have no idea what's going to happen in this race, but here are all the ways that it has gone in the past and how closely that history parallels to the moment that we're in now is one way that you can do that. I think the other way is to just try to be blunt in the writing or in the reporting that you're doing. One of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was first starting to do my own like formal campaign coverage was to keep your pieces or keep your, the package that you're doing pretty simple and communicate in very simple language that, these are the stakes. And the way that you said it to me is actually a really good way to put it. It's like, it could go either way. This is Nevada in that specific case. Like, it is always going to be competitive like this. Here are the things that we know from the empirical data. You don't say it like that, obviously, but like the polls have been saying this for a really long time. The campaign says this. What you need to understand is that polling is really difficult to do in this state. You should care about what's going on, know that you're not going to have all the information out, and that the truth is you're trying to sell a story to your audience about why they should care. And part of that responsibility is then telling them that the fact is that you're not going to know until election night or a few days after.
And that's the hard part of going out
Yeah.
and saying, well, I have no idea. And then that's not the information they're kind of looking
Right,
for.
but I think that's actually, I'm sure you've all heard this before too, but like, especially when you're reporting out a piece, it is important to come from the place of feigned ignorance, at least, right? To have people explain things to you. And sometimes that means that you're going to hear the same history over and over again. And if you're hearing that same history over and over again, it's probably important that you try to convey that to your audience too. Because if everyone is telling you something and everyone is telling you to like hang on and to just wait and see, you also have to be honest with your audience and say like, that's the best that I can do now. That's the best that everyone who knows about what's going on the ground is saying. And try to, show a little bit of your own uncertainty rather transparently and rather clearly, I'd say.
My name's also Christian.
Hi.
And I'm a politics reporter. And I was just curious, you like mentioned your beat, like you covered Democrats and like you found out, an area that you were like pretty confident in. I just kind of started this beat in August. And a lot of my colleagues on my team, they're like older and they've been doing this for a very long time. So they kind of have like a beat that like they feel very confident in. And if there's something that I'm working on or a question that I have, oftentimes my editor will be like, oh, this person is like really good at this and like this is their thing. And everyone's doing like what they're really good at and they know what their beat is. How did you get to that level? Like, how did you find out that this is an area that I'm really confident in and like this is what I want to write about? Because politics is just like so vast.
Yeah.
How did you find that?
Yeah, I can definitely say I've been there before being at Vox. I was at The Atlantic for 3 years, and like there are people there who've had careers longer than I've been alive and like are just incredibly intelligent. And I think it was, when it comes to like the specific like inner workings of whose beat is who, not stepping on other people's, terrain or trying to get advice from people, I think youth really does help you in that context, because you're not saying that you're trying to one up somebody on their own beat. You're just saying, you can just blame it on your editor and say that, I was assigned to cover this specific thing and I want to know who the best people to talk to for this are. Do you have any advice? And that really does make it awkward for them then to say no. And I've done that a lot. And it has been incredibly helpful to then feel like, okay, this person who has all that experience told me that I should talk to this other person. And then you go into that with a little bit more confidence and start from that person, and then you branch out from there and you do the hard work of like having as many chats and calls and coffees and things with those sources that could eventually help you get better at that beat that you're covering. And that's kind of how I did it. And famously, there was a pandemic and it was hard to like talk to people in person per se. And so I did do a lot of Zooms. I did do a lot of random phone calls. And to kind of get better at my specific beat, I wanted to find out who the biggest players in the field, both as journalists, columnists, bloggers, like actual activists or people who work at specific advocacy groups, and then try to see who they're all talking to, and try to see where they've been quoted and read all of that material and get a sense of like, okay, what are the talking points that they tend to get to? What are some of the questions that they tend to avoid? Maybe like you're reading a piece and you're like, I think this might be missing a specific reference to, I don't know, XYZ topic, and that person that was quoted in the story didn't speak to that. And then you're like, okay, maybe I ask that person and reach out to that specific source and ask them about that topic that maybe they weren't, they didn't talk about in that story. And also I find that it's important to get a sense of who all the big, when I'm thinking specifically of like my coverage and Latino voters, there's like a cohort of like 5 or 6 big national groups that get quoted in almost every story in some way, shape, or form. And you want to know like, okay, why are they talking to those journalists? Are there connections there perhaps? Are there motives that these specific people as like sources have for either funding or for policy or advocacy? And then try to talk to as many other people who maybe they're not necessarily enemies or haven't necessarily been scorned by them, but are also competitors in that, whether they're consultants or other pollsters or other fundraisers or other researchers, and then go to them. And then you get a little bit better understanding of like why it seems like this specific group of people have dominated kind of the sourcing on this specific beat. And in that process, you figure out like, well, actually, I am becoming authoritative on this subject because I know who the people with the influence are and the people who wish they had more influence are also. And that kind of just happens by having awkward conversations. And I have been talked down to a lot. And especially as somebody who's younger, you're like, yeah, you're right. I wasn't around like covering Bill Clinton's impeachment. like you're right. I don't know what Al Gore's vice presidency looked like. I'm sorry, but like, are there parallels to what Kamala Harris might have to face? Like, let's talk about that. And you kind of get on that.
Yeah. And then also my second question real quick. You mentioned talking to people like at a grocery store.
Yeah.
And I've like worked on stories before, like having to talk to regular people. And do you have any tips on like making that very like fruitful? Because I've experienced going to a lot of these places and like people are like, who's the president? Or they're like, why are you talking to me? Like you're some random person. Where are you from? And especially like when you talk to like minority communities, I've experienced that like as a Black reporter talking, like going into these spaces where there are people just like me and I'm like asking them questions and they're like, we don't really trust you. Like, why are you just like asking this question? And who are you writing for? Like, how do you navigate that?
I think a lot of it is kind of swallowing your pride and being willing to be embarrassed in some situations. Definitely more people have told me to go away and walk away from them than have chosen to talk to me about something. But I think there's just a huge element of luck that you have to admit when you're going into that situation, and a lot of just like hyping yourself up to know that you're going to get let down and just going, Frank, it's just like that. I think I have always been deflated whenever I do those kinds of man on the street interviews, but then you do get that one conversation that's important. And again, kind of referencing what I was telling you was you then take a step back, and that's also part of your story. Like that experience, people not knowing something, people not trusting you, and maybe it's not for that specific piece that you're working on, but it'll inform other reporting that you're going to do. And I consider that I tend to write, at the end of whatever reporting day that I've had, other than like the notes that I took while I was interviewing somebody or the recordings that I have, I tend to keep a journal to kind of capture the emotions of that specific moment and what it was that it felt like to go on that reporting trip or go on that kind of excursion to the grocery store and being told that they don't trust you. Because then you have a paper trail and you can use that for eventual writing about, like I said earlier, the bigger question of politics that you're trying to answer with this one story, or the bigger kind of narrative that you're trying to write about what American politics is in this current moment. And that ends up becoming helpful. Even if it wasn't helpful for getting that specific quote for that story that you're working on, you do have that look, like it's step back and examination of I guess how many people in the country really, and I think this is a good thing, honestly, not that many people care about politics fundamentally every single day, and honestly that makes for better conversations with those folks. And I mean that is something that I'm thinking about. Like the big paradox of like today is how little social trust there is, but how much personal trust there is among people. Like nobody cares for institutions or for really sometimes our news organizations, or for like what the president is doing, but they care about their communities, and kind of understanding that you're just always going to be at a disadvantage when trying to report that specific thing is good to then be willing to be humbled sometimes by those awkward conversations where you do run into like the person who wants to protect wants to protect abortion rights, but also is like very pro-gun rights, but also like has no idea what's happening on the economy and wishes that I don't know, that taxes on the rich were higher. And then you're like, okay, you don't fall pretty cleanly on the ideological spectrum. And like, surprise, that's the story of American politics. And a lot of people don't seem to get that. But
so one thing that I did was I had like a one sentence, basically like a media literacy kind of thing that I, just to kind of assure them, like, my goal is, like, and I'm recording this so I know that like I'm going to get it exactly right. Like I'm not going to misquote you. Like, so whatever it is that you kind of sense they're most worried about, like kind of being able to say, I'm not trying to spin anything. Like the reason I want to talk to you is because I think it's really important to have your perspective on, like that sort of thing. So even if it's just like a 10-second thing, like something to answer back with, to kind of try to build that trust.
In those situations, I always identify as a journalist first, obviously, but I don't necessarily get into all the specifics of like where I'm from, what the angle is necessarily immediately. And I don't even have my phone out or start recording the conversation until maybe like 2 minutes into that chat, if they've stopped, because at that point I'm like, okay, you've talked for me for more than a minute. There's a chance that then I can ask the question of, do you mind if I record our conversation so I can be accurate with quoting you? But I think it's knowing your kind of introduction that you're going to give, but working up to it sometimes is the way that it's worked for me. In those moments, it also helps to like, I don't know, I like just thinking to some of those moments where it's like, I like even like creep around and I'm like, hey, I'm a reporter. Do you have a minute? And they're like, huh? And you're like, yeah, and like I do the whole thing. And I mean, part of it is like me literally like reducing myself and being like, hi, I'm not a threat. I would love to talk to you about the price of eggs and that. And it's worked, I think. It has worked.
Yeah. Maybe not leading with it. I'm from DC.
Hi
Hey,
Christian,
how
how
are
are
you?
you? Hello. No, I was going to ask you, like, looking towards 2024, what storylines are you seeing beyond the traditional, like, Democrats are losing the Latino vote,
Yeah.
or Latinos are only voting based on immigration?
Yeah.
Beyond those
'Cause
stories that are clearly not true
Yeah,
anymore.
for sure.
What are you looking forward to?
So I think the really big, interesting story for me is, like I said, I'm from California. The West in general doesn't tend to get a lot of attention from DC press corps specifically, unless you came from outside of DC and have a better idea. I have just been completely stunned at how much what I was worried about earlier in my career is coming true, which is like how much more competitive the Southwest is getting and has been getting for a while. And as somebody who like my parents were in California around the time of like Prop 187 and the big like racial and political and social change that was happening in California in the early 90s, and how much that contributed to that state becoming just solidly blue. Like there are echoes of that happening across the Southwest, and some that have happened before. And a lot of it cuts across like we were talking about, like the ideological question of like, are Democrats losing Latinos? Are they voting on immigration? Are they voting on this? It's like, it does require a lot of talking to people from those places, a lot of people who are like historians of those places, or taking trips when you can, or if you have family members. That's like one of the really big like plot lines that I'm following, is what happens in Arizona, what happens in Nevada, whether New Mexico offers an example for Democrats in the Southwest, what's going on in Colorado, is it still a swing state? And that's kind of been kind of my focus for 2024, I think. And also just, especially when it comes to Latino voters, I think a lot has been said about like the differences in nationality and ethnicity and race in the voting bloc. But I do find it really interesting how in poll after poll over the last few years, like there is a growing distinction between how Mexican Americans vote and how the rest of the Latino segment votes, and trying to understand, like trying to balance that coverage appropriately, because Mexican Americans do make up like 60% or something of like Latinos in the United States. So like it matters to get that specific angle, but balancing that priority with trying to understand where recent immigrants have moved to and how they are changing that like politics in those local places, because a lot of folks from Central America and South America like don't have the same kind of like historical loyalty or historical context as older immigrants in the US, and that means that they don't align along like the same ideological spectrum that the rest of America does, suppose, right? Air quotes. But I think that's really interesting, especially when you think about like, why are so many people fans of President Lopez Obrador or Nayib Bukele, or were such big fans of Bolsonaro? And what is it about folks who live here in the States who are like big fans of those folks? Like, does that, I guess, loyalty translate into a change in how they think about American politics? So I think that's another thing that I'll be watching. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Hannah Fingerhut. I'm with the AP, and I work on polling and public opinion. Not in the business of using polls to predict how elections are going to go, and I care a lot about nuance, and sort of digging beyond a headline finding that everyone else wants to focus on. I'm wondering, when you talk politics with people that look at polls and talk about strategy and consultants and things like that, you know, obviously what they're telling you and the message they're telling you matters, right? You need to have that because they have motivations, they have influence, like, you know, that's part of understanding it. But I wonder if you have strategies for sort of pushing them past those messages and trying to sort of dig beyond what they want to tell you to get them to tell you what you want them to tell you, not what they want to tell
I mean, that's
you.
definitely something that I still struggle with, being completely honest. Like, and especially when it's people who like you go to frequently for like takes or for advice or for that quote that you need. But I think it's like knowing and being, once you're familiar enough with them, like being familiar, like pushing back slightly and being like, well, like you said this the last time we chatted, and like, did that come true? And putting the ball in their court and forcing them to defend previous takes that they've given you or previous like assumptions, because then you do get a sense of like how they're thinking about explaining away what went wrong or maybe what did go right, and then you get you get kind of an insight into the logic in their brains and how they think about things, and then that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense for how to now ask the present question. So you are like gonna get back to the question at hand, but you're referencing the last time you talked to them and saying, I guess, like asking them for the receipt and proving what happened. But it's hard because that's their job. So you just have to, I think it's do it over and over and over again, and not always use what they give you. There are a lot of people who I feel call me and want to get something like a quote published or like a take on a specific poll, or they'll have like their polls at the ready, and you're like, great, like we'll get back to this eventually.
Yeah.
I'm not working on this right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's sort of why I asked,
Yeah.
because, you know, I'm, from my perspective, I care a lot about, I mean, we have strict
Yeah.
standards for using polls, right? We're only going to, and we, as polling experts, interpret for others at the AP and other political reporters, right? But they're often coming to us, and I'm, you know, pitching at more enterprising political stories as well. And like, rightfully so, political reporters are often relying on what they're hearing and seeing from the people in politics, right? And what they're telling them. And I get that, and I've talked to strategists and pollsters and things like that plenty myself. I'm just curious, you know, that's what they're paid to do, that's what their job is. But, you know, that's not the story, and that's not, you know, the story is more than that. So I was just,
No,
your strategies are really helpful.
I feel
Thank
like that I saw a lot of that around the AP had a story about AP Votecast about young voters specifically, and that was a whole thing. And you do talk to anyone, and they'll all have, you know, quantitative data that backs up their assertion, and you do kind of have to take a step back and try to map out where on the ideological spectrum they all fall and what they benefit from pushing that specific poll or that take.
Yeah, where polling, I mean, polling and the messaging and all that, I mean, it, like you talk to a source, right? Polling is just one source. And so we, you know, in that story use Votecast, but also use X, Y, and Z to try to understand, you know, something that everyone is talking about with a little more nuance, right? Everyone was talking about young people going out for Dems, and that more so than years before, and that actually wasn't true in our data. So you know,
and that
we gave some more nuance to that,
for sure,
to that thing that everyone was talking about, to understand, well, is it actually true, and here's why or why not.
That, well, thank you, because that made up a big part of one of my pieces. So yeah,
good.
Very true.
Hi, I'm Minnie. I work at Time Magazine. I feel like so much of the way you approach your career is like how I want to approach mine in terms of, you know, writing about people of color and writing for regular people and holding politicians to account. So I started my job here pretty recently. I think they hired me to do that kind of work, but also I'm one of the youngest people in the newsroom, which means, you know, I often have to do the story of the day, the headline. And maybe I don't have the time or the money that the more established reporters get for, you know, going out into the country and like doing some of the deeper reporting. So I would love to just hear from you about your own career strategy and how you got to this position where you get those resources to do that kind of reporting. And maybe if you give like a couple examples of stories you did or connections you made that you really felt you could use for leverage to get you there.
Yeah, well, definitely I have to say that a lot of it was just luck. And like, most of the time I'm like, am I really like the person that should be asking these questions? And especially like 3 or 4 years ago when, I mean, I was at the Atlantic then, and I was like, like I'm going up against like the Ron Brownsteins of the world, or like the McKay Coppins of the world, who have excellent sourcing and excellent like reason for you to trust them in investing in them to go on a reporting trip or to do something. But I would say, so I definitely think that one of the things that has helped me this whole time has been a piece of advice that I got at one of my earlier internships, which I actually think would be, I'm not one to give like unsolicited advice, but I think this is something that actually is helpful, is to come up with like a thesis statement for your reporting, for your journalism, and for what you want to do in journalism. Something that kind of explains why it is that you want to do political journalism in general. And that often can help you with story ideas, but also with career moves and making specific jumps and asking bolder questions. And so, like in my case, a lot of it does come down to how can I explain American politics to people like my family? And that's kind of like the central question behind a lot of my journalism and the kind of what I want to do with my career. I think that would be helpful in general to just like figure out, like, yes, you're doing the daily stories now and you're writing about things that you might not necessarily want to, but you're the youngest, both maybe literally because of age or maybe like the most recent to be hired into an organization. But try to pull from each of those stories some kind of either like a source or statistic or like experience that you can then use for the enterprise or bigger stories that you do want to eventually do. And so a lot of it is literally, like I said, like sometimes you journal a little bit about what it is that you experience while writing a story. I think it's also important to debrief as many stories as you can with the editor who worked on it and just talk about what that process was like and talk about how, in very coy ways, like how that experience gave you a lesson about like what you want to work on next, and then you pop that kernel into an editor's head while you're having that kind of debrief. I think it's also like just old school like networking and talking to people, whether you're in an office or not. Like asking older reporters out for coffees and just talking to them about things. One of my favorite colleagues who I've ever worked with, he's at the Journal. No, he's at NBC now. His name's Peter Nicholas. If you don't know him, you should give him a follow. He's really good coverage of the White House and of just like the executive branch and all that kind of stuff. But I found him to be like incredibly insightful, incredibly knowledgeable, and willing to want to talk to a younger person, even though he has like so much more experience than I do. And it was using that youth to kind of get away with like asking the dumb questions and asking for advice and asking like, I think one of the easiest way to build that relationship is to ask like what their first job was and what that experience was like, and then you can bond a little bit that way, and also get a sense of like, is there anything I can learn from what they did early on in their careers that gives me a sense of what I want my next job to look like. And it is, I mean, you might have heard this a lot already, but like every editor seems to want you to take the big swing at a story and like write the definitive piece about something. And you won't always be able to do that, but if you do go into the mentality thinking about like, how is it that I can best understand this specific story, and talk to as many people as I can to say something authoritative or say something definitive about this, you might not happen at that moment, but it'll get you into the habit of thinking that way and wanting to tell that bigger enterprise story that maybe isn't pegged to the 24-hour news cycle. I don't know if that answers the question, but feel free to follow up if
You have specific examples from
Yeah.
your own career?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones was I profiled Alex Padilla, California senator, and I went into that knowing that my newsroom didn't have many Californians. So that was one thing that I was like, okay, how is it that I can tell a different story? And why is it that I'm the person who should tell this story? So it was that, a Californian, also from LA, similar profile, his background and my background, my family, his family, and thinking, okay, this is the way that I can get him to kind of open up a little bit more and talk to me about some of the realities that maybe another journalist on the Hill wouldn't be able to get him to say. Famously, he was also not a very like personable figure on the Hill, and he was pretty new. But so we talked a little bit about his upbringing, about the work that his parents did, and it was those elements plus the knowledge that I had worked with one of his comms directors before, and so I was like, I have a little bit of a leg in, or not a leg, a way into like getting a significant amount of time with him, and then assembling all of that together to the editor and being like, this is why he's the person to tell this bigger story about Latino politics in the U.S. And why he should be interesting. So doing your homework, but finding those kind of innovative ways that you can tell a story that nobody else at your organization can tell. And sometimes that's like, the youth is another side of it. Like this TikTok story that I wrote, like I spend hours on TikTok, unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you do. And I've seen this particular congressman over and over and over again. And I was like, one, I need to meet him. Two, I like have talked to his like press secretary before because I covered a campaign somewhere, I'm trying to remember, but I was like, this is a story that only I can do right now because nobody else on my team is as online maybe as I am, even though we're all pretty online, which is very detrimental. But I think it was also fun because everybody was focused on George Santos at the time. And I was like, I'm not going to find a really smart way into the Santos stories. Why everybody's focused on China and TikTok and nobody's written about him before. So let me choose that. And I'm the person that you should trust because unfortunately, like TikTok is a poison in my brain and I can't stop thinking about it. So 2 examples there.
Hi, Christian.
Hi.
So working for the Anchorage Daily News, my bread and butter are really like 600 to 800 word
Yeah.
pieces about Alaska policy and politics from DC. I really want to do more enterprise and features writing, but I'm always pretty intimidated to tackle those types of stories.
Sure,
and
yeah.
often my hang up is on the writing side and figuring out how to keep a story engaging from start to finish. So I'm curious, given that that's a lot of what you do, what
Yeah.
advice you'd have for someone like me?
Yeah, definitely find interesting characters for the piece. The way that I always approach those pieces is, I mentioned this before, but like I think of an argument to make with a specific piece. Like, what is it that I'm trying to say? Is it something new about how state politics run? Is it something new about a specific like policy issue, like wildlife, like the environment, like farming? And what is it? What is like the bigger case that I'm trying to make with specific characters? Once you have an idea of what that bigger argument is, you have a natural plot line that you can follow to write a piece. And then you think about like the specific characters that you can fit into it. Sometimes that means that you have like one central figure that you're going to try to focus on, and hopefully you do get access to them. But it's starting from that person. And I always like map it out on a piece of paper. I don't know what it's called, but it's like where you start with like a word and a word bubble or a bubble around it, and then you kind of branch out from there. And that's kind of how I devise an idea of the reporting that needs to happen, maybe like a timeline that I want to follow, or where specific moments of a person's life fit into that broader argument that I'm trying to make. And again, always ask the question, because it tends to matter for the average American. It's like, why does this matter in the greater context of American politics, or in the greater context of the specific kind of genre that you're in? And that'll give you a reason to make it interesting too. Because once you kind of have an answer to that, that's what you're building up to in the story when you get to the writing of it. And I think the best advice that I've always gotten is, well, I'm kind of going on two different tangents here, because I was going to say, train yourself out of something that I'm currently still trying to train myself out of, which is like over polishing when you're drafting a story and just spending so much time on the first sentence or the first paragraph and just getting things onto the paper, like the sheet of paper. That is like incredibly difficult, but I feel like once you master that, like so much more creativity and imagination opens up itself to you to be able to make an interesting piece. But the other thing I was going to say is, sometimes, depending on how long the stories are, I feel like most features and most profiles are 1,000 words too long. And so I should try to keep that, obviously scale that down to however long the piece that you're going to have to write is. But think about being very sparing with your words, because like most people read my stories for no more than like 2.5 to 3 minutes, depending on like how long they are. Some of them that are longer, like thankfully people do stay and read for the whole thing, because it turns out that a bunch of nerds read our website, which we love. I know this is on the record, which we love. But yeah, once you do get to the finish the draft, like know that you should cut back a significant amount of that, and that makes it more readable and more engaging to your audience as well. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
So my question is kind of similar to Mariana's question, and taking consideration ahead, looking ahead to 2024, and also taking consideration that you cover Democrats as well. I think we've heard more of Republicans than from Democrats. We're also still waiting what's going to happen with Biden ahead of 2024. What are you looking, or what are some of the headlines that you're looking from Democrats ahead, or like from 2024?
Like what they'll be doing? Or,
yeah, like what are the things that you are monitoring from Democrats?
I'm definitely seeing like the big thing, and it gets back to our question of journalism, is like, how much do the American people know about what's actually happened? I think today there was a Post poll, not to go back to polling, but that said something like, I forget the percentage, but a significant number of Americans don't think that Joe Biden has done much or has like accomplished much in Congress, or which is like, is funny just in general, because we all know we cover this stuff. But then at the same time, people who are very dissatisfied with him will still not like punish him completely in some of that, like the crosstab data. And I think that was like a very interesting bit from the midterms, was like dissatisfaction with the president, with the direction of the country, but not willing to punish them electorally. And so I think that's like one big thing, is I'll be watching how Democrats try to sell their accomplishments, how much they choose to side with making the positive case for everything that they've done versus that negative contrast choice, like decision that they make by contrasting their work with what Republicans are doing. So that's one significant thing. I'm also looking to see, I'm really interested in like how establishment and elected Democrats unite around primary challenges and beating those back. Obviously, as I said, from the West Coast, I'm looking at California and Arizona a lot, and seeing how those elections are going to unfold, and seeing who it is that's stepping up right now to, endorse / getting ready for ideological battles, which I find really funny too, because like the average American has no idea what progressive really means anymore, because you do have very far left folks who say that elected Dems aren't progressive. You have the progressives in Congress who are very vocally progressive, and you know who they are, and then you have the folks who like wouldn't call themselves progressives but are embracing some of those policies, but also don't know how to communicate that to their constituents. So trying to see how they talk about that kind of stuff. I think it was actually kind of funny to see who voted for and against the resolution condemning socialism yesterday, 2 days ago, last week. It's today, Tuesday, Monday. That's embarrassing. But yeah, like to see
It's Monday.
yeah,
So don't worry.
to see who was like voting for it or against it, and to try to map them out. Like, obviously, this person is going to say socialism bad, why, and try to see like who was it that said no, and why is it, and how does this fit with my understanding of their kind of their political identity and how they think about their constituents too. And also like how people deal with the whole like socialism accusation still is another big thing that I'll be looking at, because it falls under the banner of the traditional Republican attack of like big government and overreach. But I definitely think that it's morphed recently in the last 2-3 years. So I'll definitely be watching that too.
I'm curious with campaigns as well going into 2024, especially with primaries. If you have to cover like multiple candidates nationwide and not so much regionally, how do you like pick what's important to the average American, whether they're in the Beltway or in South Dakota, and tell them what this meant or why this was important at this one rally for this one candidate, and not necessarily sounding repetitive for all of the primary challengers or something like that? Like, how do you make it relevant quickly, and then next week when they have another rally, make it relevant again?
Yeah, I guess part of that is like choosing the stories that you're going to try to report out, because you can't cover everyone, like everything or everyone. But again, this bigger theme of like trying to connect it to a greater theory for what's happening in American politics in this moment. Like, does this specific rally and the specific candidate in the moment that person is in right now say something about where we are as a country in terms of our politics? And then once you do get to that bigger question, you can then also make it more local to a specific audience that you're thinking of, whether that's like a specific focus on issues, or sometimes it's about like rhetoric and questions about like political violence, or about politics becoming too heated, or you kind of find a theme to connect it back to that matters in that person's life. But pick and choose your battles, and think about like what that bigger question is that you're trying to answer with this candidate, and that makes it a little bit more like digestible, I would say.
Hey, I'm Kirsten, and I work for Cox Media Group. So basically, we cover DC for several local TV stations. So very much the local person who doesn't understand DC. Looking at the 24, I've always been conscious of minority voters, and I've done a lot of like the Black voter stories. But I have also been trying to dive into Latino voters, because I know, well, at least right now, I'm the only person of color in my office. So it's like I'm thinking about these issues, and I too know there's more than just immigration. What are some of the, I guess, what advice do you have for what are some of the groups maybe nationally who are good to look to start kind of tap again? I don't want to marginalize like because I know there's so many nuances,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's also, this is not my, like, I know the Black voter stuff because that's also part of my own personal,
Yeah.
growing up experience. But I want to make sure we're tapping into groups who are kind of, do have a pulse to some of the issues or are connected to different groups. Kind of any suggestions for places to go or groups to
Yeah.
kind of start looking to make those connections now for 24. So we kind of know
Yeah.
how to get more accurate, inclusive coverage.
I can definitely give you some suggestions after. I think the big thing is like look at who's on TV, see what it is that they're saying, compare that to some of the, like, find who some of the big reporters on that beat might be, and see if they're also quoting from them or if they're taking a more critical lens at them. And also, like, there are some like big, so like when I was referencing some of the bigger groups like Voto Latino, or more regionally, like when you're looking at like funding, like Somos Votantes is another big like money driving organization. And then the other ones are like NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, and yeah, there's like a bunch of groups that are focused on like the politics and then on the organizing side of it too. And then there are more recently some more established like conservative or Republican aligned organizations too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, go back to something you said earlier about sometimes the relevance of the home country politics, like AMLO, Bolsonaro, etc. Can you talk about like in what, maybe like what are some kind of areas where that is more relevant? Because I mean, like in South Texas, like a lot of the folks who are there like predate the Republic of Texas, so like AMLO may not be as important, but like the Indian American community in Houston is like, there's a lot of like a big BJP presence there. So like, what are some kind of areas, what are some kind of communities where that's more relevant? When do you kind of determine when to look into the home country politics?
Yeah, I definitely look at it when I think of like where it is that waves of recent immigration have settled, like specific states and specific communities, and sometimes it's specific neighborhoods. Definitely like in DC, you can also notice that there's been like influx of more people into the city or into like the surrounding suburbs as well when you look at some of the census data. And so I think I think of there's like a little bit of like a contrarianism that I use too, where I'm like, what is the common assumption about how people are going to vote, and is there something that could complicate that in a specific vote, like a specific demographic? Like I have a lot of friends from Orange County, for example, in California. That's like one of the places that I look to like voting results recently. And is there like some kind of like national background or heritage that kind of informs why a specific neighborhood or region might want to shift Republican or shift Democratic? And so I think a lot of it is also just like talking to your friends and talking to, like, especially if you have like family or friends who are tapped into specific immigrant communities, like talk to them about what it is that they're thinking and talking about among that, among family or friends. Because I think that one thing that's really helpful in that regard is to not be friends with just journalists and to be friends with people with normal jobs, because that's how you also just build out your sourcing tremendously too, and also stay sane. Like, I think I'm friends with like, I try to be friends with fewer politics reporters than yeah. That's a little much.
Christian, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I hope that was helpful. And I mean, I don't really know much, but not to discount it all. But
I would disagree based on the past hour, but thank you.